President Bola Tinubu has called for reforms in the UN Security Council, advocating for permanent seats for Nigeria and other African countries. The president also wants urgent debt relief for Nigeria and other developing countries, stressing that current financial systems hinder their progress. The president made the request while addressing world leaders at the 79th session of the UN General Assembly in New York through his vice president Kashim Shettima. Tinubu wants world leaders to recommit to multilateralism, inclusivity, equality, and cooperation to address global challenges such as terrorism, climate change, poverty, and food crisis. The Nigerian leader also called for comprehensive debt relief measures and the recovery of proceeds from corruption and illicit financial flows. He expressed concerns about the fragility of democracy in some African countries and emphasized the need for economic development, peace and security to support democratic governance. We now turn to Professor Eghosa Osagie, the Director General of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. He will be discussing President Tinubu's advocacy for a permanent seat for Nigeria at the UN Security Council and the call for debt cancellation, why Nigeria deserves it, and what impact will the status have on Nigeria. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us on Newsday.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, let's start with the president's request for Nigeria to have a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. How easy or challenging will this be?
Well, the president is taking to its logical conclusion a demand that has come out of Nigeria's, Africa's, and the Global South's advocacy for the reform of the United Nations, the democratization of a world body that has more or less, been in charge of the enforcement of a rules-based global system. Now, you know that the United Nations came into being at a time when the Second World War ended, and therefore its organs have been a reflection of how that war ended and who emerged victorious and who didn't. Now, the United Nations has been led more or less by the Security Council. It's a Security Council that has 5 permanent members. And the world has moved on, beyond the Cold War to a world that was verging on a unipolar configuration to today's world that has evolved into several centers of power. And the configuration of the UN Security Council, with its 5 permanent members, no longer fits in with the present realities. Remember that the UN Security Council is a very powerful organ of the United Nations. Some say it is one reason why, the UN itself has become less effective, because the powers that are involved have, left out large segments of the world, important regions and emerging powers. And therefore, there's been a clamor, there's been a global demand to reform the UN, beginning with the membership of the Security Council, to expand it, to have new people who represent different regions of the world. For us in Africa, in 2005, there was the Zulwini Consensus that demanded 2 permanent seats for Africa and 5 non-permanent seats. That demand also said the 2 permanent seats for Africa should come with the veto power. And there was a debate over which African countries would be the best candidates for permanent seats, in the Security Council. Nigeria, of course, as a clear African leader, was in the forefront of this. South Africa was mentioned, Egypt was mentioned, Kenya was mentioned, and so on. But at that time, what the Zulwini consensus had was, give us the 2 permanent seats and the 5 non-permanent seats, of course with the veto power for the 2 permanent members from Africa, but leave us as Africans to determine who would have these seats. That was the letter and spirit of the Zulwini consensus. Now, the rest of the world, the global south, together with many allies, including Germany and Sweden and so on, have supported, the opening up of the Security Council. There have been issues and contentions over whether they should come with veto power or not, but the time has come, everyone agrees, even from the Summit of the Futures that the United Nations itself held last week, that the time has come to democratize, to make the UN, especially the Security Council, more inclusive, more equitable, and therefore better positioned to deal with matters. Don't forget that the Security Council is the only organ of the United Nations whose resolutions are binding on all members. This is the one that takes, primary responsibility for the peace and security of the world as a whole. It deals with matters of membership, and we have seen over the decades since the United Nations came into being, but especially in the days of the Cold War, that the use of veto power has worked, against the interests of many countries in the global south, and so on. It is the Security Council that takes charge of peacekeeping operations. Now, you will know that in the history of peacekeeping, Nigeria has been in the forefront. We have embraced peacekeeping, and we have contributed the most, one of the greatest contributors to peacekeeping. So, as an African leader, as the biggest economy in Africa, as a great contributor to the search for peace and global shared prosperity, Nigeria is preeminently qualified for a United Nations Security Council permanent seat with a veto power. And, that's the history. That's, the progression that has led us to this present thing. So it's not today's clamor. It's a clamor that goes back to the consciousness in the global south, that we cannot continue to be left out of, the
discussion,
the critical organs of the United Nations.
Now, Professor, you make a great case, or we all make a great case for Nigeria to be on the council, but honestly, with the background of all the chaos that's going on in the world, in the global north, should we say, it seems like we're on the brink of World War II. We have the crisis in the Middle East. We have Israel versus Hezbollah. We have Israel versus Gaza. We have Ukraine and Russia. And we know that these have been spiraling out of control for some time now. It seems like the entire world's focus is on these major upsets in these areas of the globe. How feasible and how realistic is it that they would now turn their direction away and start to consider Africa's position at the table, knowing that it has always been taken a back burner anyways? Is this the time that we will see Nigeria being put forth onto the council, or should we maybe give it some time and retry when things are not as chaotic?
Well, it's a pity that in that chaotic world, you have not mentioned the crisis in the Congo. You have not mentioned the flashpoints in the Sahel. You've not mentioned Sudan. You've not mentioned Ethiopia. You've not mentioned, these areas of great calamities in the world. And that's precisely the point that, the advocates of the democratization and the equitability of the membership of the Security Council have made. So we can no longer afford to have a world where we all don't matter, where the interests of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 countries will determine, what the interests of the rest of us would be, or even that our interests don't even come to reckoning at all.
Professor,
now, it would be nice, you think of it.
You're completely right. So that was my point as well. The world is distracted. Even though we have so many issues going on here on the continent as well, we see where the focus is. So I guess a better question would have been, how do we get them to focus more on us? I know this rallying to be on the Security Council is one of them, but are there any other measures that can be implemented in order to cut through the noise of all the wars and disasters that are going on in the global north?
Well, it is just as well that the United Nations is key. It's the key multilateral institution in the world. But we have a whole, constellation of multilateral institutions, including the international financial institutions, the Bretton Woods Institutes, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, all of these bodies. But you will find that there's a common thread running through all of them. What you call the relegation and marginalization of the kinds of issues that would be of primary concern to Africa, to Asia, to Latin America, and to the rest of the global South. Now, equity would mean, that if you think the issues are about elephants, don't forget the analogy that says there are elephants and there are ants. The elephant has its headache, the ant also has its headache. So, you can dominate things, but let that be a bargained position. Let us also have a say in what we are doing. Now, how can we be places where you come to do peacekeeping operations, but we don't feature in the peacekeeping committee, for instance, that has been monopolized by members of the P5 in the Security Council? Now, how can we, have things to do with the International Court of Justice at The Hague, and the P5 would have such a big say on matters that we think, would need some kind of review, and yet we don't have a say in those kinds of things. So this is the whole point. It's not about how do we get them to understand. The first thing is to get them to see that the world has moved on beyond the configuration that ended the Second World War. The world today is a world of emerging powers. I mean, you think of countries like India, you think of countries like Brazil, you think of Nigeria, you think of South Africa, you think of, Egypt, and so on. These are emerging powers, that as a matter of right, now should have a greater say in the determination of the kinds of things that, the UN, is doing. Don't forget that everyone, not everyone, but many people agree today that the UN, can be more effective than it has been. Look at the SDGs that we've been talking about, so many years. The SDGs, will soon come to fruition, but we are very far from realizing the goals, that have been outlined in the Sustainable Development Agenda. So we say, that the time is now. Because the world has changed, and the kinds of interests that displaced other interests, will no longer be a valid argument, and that is why the global South coalitions that you have seen across the board everywhere, but especially in BRICS and the other coalitions that the global South has been building. This global South has been very clear in its mind, that we are deserving of, one, reforms in the UN, the reforms that would include the expansion of the membership of the Security Council, and so on. That's the only way, because the the greatest leverage, that many small countries, weak countries have is in the United Nations system.
Now,
Yes.
Professor, apart from, getting permanent seats at the Security Council, the president also called for financial reform and debt forgiveness, which is quite similar to what President Olusegun Obasanjo pushed for and obtained from the Paris Club at the time. But looking at Nigeria's track record and its many tales of corruption, how deserving really is Nigeria of debt forgiveness?
Well, you might as well say that no country in the world is deserving of anything. The point is that corruption is not a Nigerian. The incidents might be higher in some places than in other places. But the point about debt and debt forgiveness is the multiplier effect it has on issues of poverty, issues of deprivation, issues of social justice. What is the debt all about? These are poor countries, and that makes them very vulnerable. We, unfortunately, are not able to do many of the things we want to do with our own resources. So everyone, is in the business of saying, can we get some support, external support, and so on. Now, and that, we've been on this whole track all the time. The demand for debt forgiveness is not a Nigerian patent. It's something that the global south, many countries in Africa, many countries across Asia and so on, have demanded. And there comes, a time when you have some kind of reprieve, some kind of amnesty, some kind of resetting, and so on. There is no way, the debt burden, would continue to breathe down our necks, and we would get the kinds of traction of development that we expect to have. And, one of the things that we have seen in the global system is that this therapy has been deployed in, several parts of the world. So why not? Nigeria is deserving. Nigeria has all the potential. Nigeria is one of the big, actors in this. And don't forget, that the volume of debt that we're talking about is huge. So we can do with some forgiveness. It's a moral duty. It's a moral right, and that's not tied to corruption. If we tie it to corruption, then very few countries in the world would be eligible for such considerations.
Osagie, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this conversation here on Newsday.